The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Miller's diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that day, her movements automatic and practiced. At 28, she had been working at this small-town diner for nearly 3 years, and the routine had become second nature to her. Pour coffee, take orders, serve plates, clean tables, repeat. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had chosen after everything that had happened. The diner sat on the edge of Millbrook, a sleepy town in rural Pennsylvania where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Sarah had moved here precisely for that anonymity that small towns could offer to outsiders. She kept to herself, did her job well, and nobody asked too many questions about where she had come from or what she had done before. That was exactly how she liked it. Her black hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore long-sleeved shirts even in the summer heat. The other waitresses had noticed, of course. Jenny, who had worked at Miller's since the Clinton administration, had made several comments about Sarah's choice of clothing. "Honey, it's 90 degrees outside. Aren't you burning up in those sleeves?" she would ask with genuine concern. Sarah would just smile and change the subject, redirecting the conversation to the weather or the latest gossip about the mayor's wife. The truth was, Sarah had secrets written on her skin. Secrets she wasn't ready to share with anyone, especially not the good people of Millbrook who saw her as nothing more than the quiet waitress who always remembered their coffee preferences and never forgot to ask about their families. Her arms told a story that belonged to a different life, a different version of herself that she had carefully buried beneath layers of normalcy and routine. This particular Tuesday started like any other. The morning rush brought in the usual suspects. Bob the mechanic, who always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast, Mrs. Henderson, who insisted on decaf even though everyone knew she switched to regular when her husband wasn't looking, and Tommy the postal worker, who flirted harmlessly with all the waitresses but never meant anything by it. Sarah moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her smile genuine but guarded, her conversations pleasant but surface level. It was around 10:30 when the atmosphere in the diner began to shift. A group of motorcycle riders had pulled up outside, their heavy bikes gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah watched through the window as they removed their helmets and adjusted their leather jackets. There were 5 of them, all wearing the colors of some motorcycle club she didn't recognize. They looked rough around the edges, the kind of men who had seen their share of trouble and weren't afraid of finding more. Jenny appeared at Sarah's elbow, nervous energy radiating from her small frame. "I don't like the look of those boys," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "Maybe we should call Sheriff Morrison." Sarah studied the group more carefully. The leader appeared to be a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying temples and arms covered in tattoos. Behind him, 4 younger men clustered together, their body language suggesting they were used to following orders. They didn't look like the type to cause trouble in a small-town diner, but Sarah had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. "They're just travelers passing through," Sarah said quietly, though she kept her eyes on the group as they approached the door. "Everyone deserves a hot meal and a cup of coffee." The bell above the door chimed as the 5 men entered, their boots heavy on the floor. The diner fell silent except for the soft jazz playing from the ancient radio behind the counter. Every conversation stopped, every fork paused midway to mouths, every eye turned to watch the newcomers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The leader of the group scanned the room, taking in the worried faces and defensive postures of the other customers. His expression remained neutral, professional even. When his eyes met Sarah's, she saw something there that surprised her. Intelligence, certainly, but also a kind of weariness that she recognized. It was the look of someone who had carried heavy burdens and made difficult choices. "Table for 5, he said simply, his voice low and controlled. Sarah nodded and grabbed a handful of menus from behind the counter. "Right this way," she said, leading them to a large booth in the back corner of the diner. It was the table that most people avoided because it was near the kitchen door and the constant traffic could be distracting, but she sensed these men would prefer to have their backs to the wall and a clear view of the entire restaurant. As they settled into the booth, Sarah noticed the way they arranged themselves. The leader sat in the center, facing the door, while the others positioned themselves to cover different angles of the room. It was subtle, but Sarah recognized the tactical thinking behind their seating arrangement. These weren't just motorcycle enthusiasts out for a weekend ride. These were men who had been trained to think about security, about potential threats, about escape routes. "Can I start you gentlemen with some coffee?" Sarah asked, her pen poised over her order pad. "Coffee all around," the leader confirmed. "And we'll need a few minutes to look at the menu." As Sarah poured their coffee, she became aware of the whispered conversations starting up again throughout the diner. She could hear fragments of speculation. Never seen them before. Those tattoos. Wonder what they're doing here. The paranoia was understandable. Millbrook wasn't used to strangers, especially strangers who looked like they could handle themselves in a fight. When she returned with the coffee pot to top off their cups, one of the younger men was studying her intently. He had short brown hair and intelligent green eyes, and there was something about the way he carried himself that reminded Sarah of people she used to know. People from her old life. "You've got good situational awareness," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Most waitresses wouldn't have noticed how we positioned ourselves." Sarah's hand tightened on the coffee pot handle, but her expression remained neutral. "I notice things," she said simply. "It's part of the job." The man exchanged a look with the leader, who had been watching the interaction carefully. There was communication happening between them that didn't require words, the kind of silent conversation that came from years of working together in high-stress situations. "What's your name, miss?" the leader asked politely. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Martinez." "Well, Sarah Martinez, we appreciate the hospitality. This is a nice town you have here. Peaceful." There was something in the way he said peaceful that made Sarah think he knew exactly how precious that quality was, how rare it could be in the world beyond Millbrook's borders. She had the distinct feeling that this man had spent time in places where peace was a luxury that couldn't be taken for granted. "Have you decided what you'd like to order?" she asked, deflecting the conversation back to safer ground. They ordered simple fare, burgers, fries, pie. Food that could be eaten quickly if they needed to leave in a hurry. As Sarah walked back to the kitchen to place their order, she was acutely aware of the weight of their attention. They were watching her move, studying her mannerisms, picking up on details that most people would miss. In the kitchen, old Pete the cook was already grumbling about the new customers. "Don't like the look of them," he muttered as he slapped burger patties onto the grill. "Troublemakers, if you ask me." "Nobody's asking," Sarah replied mildly, but her mind was racing. There was something about the motorcycle group that felt familiar, something that triggered memories she had spent 3 years trying to forget. The way they moved, the way they watched, the casual confidence that came from knowing they could handle whatever situation might arise. When she brought out their food, the conversation at their table stopped abruptly. She set down the plates with practiced efficiency, but as she reached across to place the leader's burger in front of him, her sleeve rode up slightly. It was only for a second, barely noticeable, but the young man with green eyes caught a glimpse of something on her forearm that made him stiffen. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "could I ask you about that tattoo?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. She quickly tugged her sleeve down, but it was too late. The damage was done. All 5 men were now looking at her with new interest, their casual demeanor replaced by sharp focus. "I'm sorry," she said, playing for time, hoping she had misunderstood the question. "Your tattoo," the young man repeated. "I could have sworn I saw. Well, it looked like military ink." The diner seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah was aware of Jenny watching from across the room, of old Pete peering through the kitchen window, of the other customers trying to pretend they weren't listening to every word. "I think you're mistaken," Sarah said carefully. "If you need anything else, just let me know." She turned to walk away, but the leader's voice stopped her. "Sarah," he said, and there was something different in his tone now. Not threatening, but serious. Respectful, even. "We're not here to cause any trouble. But if what my friend thinks he saw is accurate, then you and I might have more in common than either of us expected." Sarah turned back slowly, her heart pounding. These weren't random motorcycle riders passing through town. These were military men, probably veterans, and they had recognized something in her that she had tried so hard to hide. The careful anonymity she had built over 3 years was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I don't know what you think you saw, she said quietly, but I'm just a waitress in a small town. Nothing more. The leader studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her carefully constructed facade. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but insistent. Sarah Martinez, he said slowly, as if testing the name. You know, that's interesting. Because 3 years ago, I served with someone who had skills very similar to what I'm seeing in you right now. Someone who could read a room, assess threats, move with the kind of precision that only comes from extensive training. Sarah's mouth went dry. I think you have me confused with someone else. Maybe, the man acknowledged. But that someone else was one hell of a soldier. One hell of a sniper, actually. And if you're who I think you might be, then you've got nothing to be ashamed of. The word sniper hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah was vaguely aware that conversations throughout the diner had stopped entirely, that every person in the room was now openly staring at their table. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like all her carefully built defenses had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. You're making a mistake, she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was pointless. These men had seen through her disguise with the practiced eye of people who had lived in the same world she had once inhabited. The leader reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately so as not to alarm her. He pulled out a worn photograph and placed it on the table between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the image. A group of soldiers in combat gear, standing in front of an armored vehicle somewhere in Afghanistan. And there, third from the left, was a younger version of herself. Sergeant Sarah Chun, the leader said quietly. Sniper Division, 75th Ranger Regiment. 2 tours in Afghanistan, decorated for valor under fire, credited with saving the lives of dozens of fellow soldiers. The photograph lay on the table like an accusation, a piece of evidence that connected her current life to a past she had tried desperately to leave behind. Sarah stared at it, remembering the weight of her rifle, the feeling of sand in her gear, the faces of the men and women who had depended on her skills to keep them safe. My name is Sarah Martinez, she said again, but her voice lacked conviction now. Your name was Sarah Chun, the leader corrected gently. What happened, Sergeant? Why are you hiding in a place like this? Sarah looked around the diner, suddenly, seeing it through new eyes. The worried faces of her co-workers, the fearful expressions of the regular customers who thought they knew her, the life she had built that was based entirely on concealing who she really was. The weight of 3 years of pretending crashed down on her all at once. I need to get back to work, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. But, as she turned to leave, she knew that everything had changed. Her secret was out, at least partially, and there was no putting it back. The 5 men at the corner table knew exactly who she was, and, more importantly, they knew what she had been. The question now was what they planned to do with that information, and whether the peaceful life she had built in Millbrook could survive the revelation of her true identity. The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a blur of mechanical motions and racing thoughts. She poured coffee without tasting it, took orders without really hearing them, and cleaned tables while her mind remained fixed on the photograph that still lay on the corner table. The 5 men had finished their meal and left shortly after their revelation, but not before the leader had quietly slipped a business card under his empty coffee cup. Sarah had palmed it quickly, hoping no one had noticed, but the burning sensation in her pocket suggested that secrets had a way of making themselves known. Jenny had tried to ask questions, of course. What did those men want with you, honey? You looked like you'd seen a ghost when you came back from their table. But Sarah had deflected with practiced ease, claiming they had simply mistaken her for someone they used to know. It wasn't entirely a lie, she told herself, though the distinction felt meaningless now that her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. When her shift finally ended at 4 o'clock, Sarah drove home to her small apartment above the hardware store in downtown Millbrook. The business card felt heavy in her pocket as she climbed the narrow stairs to her front door. Once inside, she locked the door behind her and drew the curtains before finally pulling out the card to examine it properly. Marcus Reed, U.S. Army Rangers, Ret. Private Security Consultant. Below the name was a phone number and an email address, nothing more. Clean, professional, exactly what she would have expected from the man who had recognized her so easily. Sarah turned the card over and found a handwritten message in neat block letters. Some conversations are worth having. When you're ready. Mr. Sarah set the card on her kitchen table and stared at it while she made herself a cup of tea. Marcus Reed. The name was familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. There had been so many names, so many faces during her time in the service. The military was a vast network of interconnected relationships, and it wasn't unusual for paths to cross and recross in unexpected ways. She pulled out her laptop and, after a moment's hesitation, opened a web browser. For 3 years, she had avoided any online searches related to her military service, afraid of what she might find or who might be looking for her. But Marcus Reed had already found her, which meant her hiding was over whether she liked it or not. A search for Marcus Reed Army Rangers yielded several results, including a LinkedIn profile and a few news articles about a private security firm called Sentinel Solutions. According to his profile, Reed had served 22 years in the Army, including multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan as part of various special operations units. His company specialized in providing security services for high-risk humanitarian missions and corporate interests in unstable regions. One of the news articles included a photograph from a veterans charity event, and Sarah immediately recognized Reed as the man who had sat across from her in the diner booth. He looked older in the military dress uniform, more formal, but there was no mistaking those intelligent eyes or the bearing that spoke of years of command responsibility. As she scrolled through the search results, Sarah found herself thinking about the other men who had been with Reed. They had all had that same quality, that unmistakable mark of military training that she recognized because she carried it herself. But, more than that, they had moved and thought like special operations personnel. Elite soldiers who had seen combat and survived to talk about it. The sun was setting by the time Sarah worked up the courage to call the number on the card. It rang 3 times before Reed's familiar voice answered. Marcus Reed. It's Sarah Martinez, she said, then paused. Or Sarah Chun, I suppose you'd prefer. I'd prefer whatever name makes you comfortable, Reed replied, his tone warm but professional. Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure I should be, Sarah admitted. What do you want from me, Mr. Reed? First, call me Marcus. Second, I want to have a conversation that I think we both need to have. You've been hiding out in that town for 3 years, and I'm willing to bet you've been going quietly crazy trying to pretend you're someone you're not. Sarah was quiet for a moment, struck by how accurately he had read her situation. How did you find me? We didn't find you, Marcus said. Running into you today was pure chance. We were passing through on our way to a job in Philadelphia when one of my guys insisted we stop for lunch. Said he had a good feeling about the place. The young man with green eyes. That's Danny Walsh. He's got good instincts about people, which is why he spotted your ink even when you try to hide it. He spent 2 tours as a spotter for Marine snipers in Helmand Province, so he knows what to look for. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You're all military. All veterans, yes. We work together now in the private sector, but we served in different units during our active duty years. Danny was Marines, I was Rangers, Jake did Navy SEAL operations, Carlos was Army intelligence, and Big Mike was Air Force pararescue. We're what you might call a diverse skill set. And what exactly do you do now? Marcus was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. We help people who need helping. Sometimes that's corporate executives who need protection in dangerous countries. Sometimes it's humanitarian workers who need security while they're trying to save lives. And sometimes it's veterans who are hiding from their own shadows. The last comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. I'm not hiding from anything. Aren't you? Sarah, I looked up your service record after we left the diner. What I found was impressive as hell, and also tragic as hell. You were one of the best snipers your regiment ever produced, credited with confirmed kills that saved American lives. You received the Bronze Star with V device for valor under fire. And then, 3 years ago, you just disappeared. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the weight of the medal when they had pinned it to her uniform. It had felt like an anchor dragging her down rather than an honor lifting her up. Some medals come with a price. What happened over there, Sarah? What made you decide to walk away from everything? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Sarah wasn't ready to explore. She had spent 3 years avoiding that very question, burying the memories beneath layers of routine and normalcy. The idea of dragging them back into the light felt overwhelming. "I can't talk about this over the phone," she said finally. "Then, let's talk in person. My team and I are staying at the Comfort Inn on Route 15 tonight. Room 237. Come by whenever you're ready, or if you prefer, we can meet somewhere public. There's a park near the town square that looks quiet enough for a private conversation." Sarah found herself nodding even though he couldn't see her. The park. 8 o'clock. "We'll be there," Marcus confirmed. "And Sarah? For what it's worth, I think you've been carrying something heavy for too long. Sometimes it helps to share the load." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her darkening apartment and tried to decide what to do next. Part of her wanted to pack a bag and disappear again, to find another small town where she could reinvent herself once more. But a larger part of her was exhausted by the constant pretending, tired of living a life that felt like an elaborate performance. She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and slowly rolled up her sleeves, revealing the tattoos she had kept hidden for so long. On her right forearm was the distinctive insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, surrounded by dates and coordinates that marked significant moments in her military career. On her left arm, a more complex design told the story of her specialized training. Crosshairs superimposed over a mountain landscape, with the words "one shot, one kill" written in elegant script below. But it was the third tattoo, the one Danny Walsh had glimpsed in the diner, that carried the most weight. On the inside of her left wrist, small enough that it was usually covered by her watch, were two words that defined her military specialty: Sniper Division. Sarah traced the letters with her finger, remembering the day she had gotten the tattoo. It had been after her first successful long-range engagement, when her shot had eliminated an enemy fighter who was targeting a group of American soldiers. She had been proud of her skills then, proud of her ability to protect her fellow service members from distances that seemed impossible. That pride felt like a lifetime ago. At 7:30, Sarah walked to the town square park, arriving early so she could choose the meeting location. She selected a bench near the gazebo, positioned so that she would have a clear view of anyone approaching. Old habits died hard, even when you were trying to bury them. Marcus and his team arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, approaching from different directions in a casual pattern that was obviously tactical. They weren't taking any chances, even in a sleepy town like Millbrook. Danny Walsh was the first to reach her, offering a respectful nod before taking up a position where he could watch the perimeter. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said as he settled onto the bench beside her. The other three men arranged themselves nearby, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to give them privacy. "I'm not sure why I did," Sarah admitted. "For 3 years, I've managed to avoid conversations like this." "Because you weren't ready for them 3 years ago," Marcus replied. "But hiding gets harder over time, not easier. Eventually, the person you're pretending to be starts to feel like a prison." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the evening light fade over the town square. "How do you know so much about hiding?" Marcus rolled up his own sleeve, revealing a complex tattoo that covered most of his forearm. At its center was the Ranger tab she recognized, but surrounding it were other symbols, dates, and coordinates that told the story of a long and difficult military career. "Because I tried it too," he said simply. "After my discharge, I spent 2 years trying to pretend I was a regular civilian. Got a job at a bank, wore a tie every day, went to office parties where people complained about traffic and weather. I was miserable as hell, but I thought that was the price of being normal. What changed? I met Jake." Marcus nodded toward one of his team members, a compact man with salt and pepper hair who was watching the street with practiced alertness. "He found me drunk in a bar one night, crying into a beer about how much I missed the clarity of combat. He told me something that changed my perspective on everything." "What did he tell you?" "He said that some people are warriors by nature, and asking a warrior to pretend to be a civilian is like asking a wolf to pretend to be a house cat. You might pull it off for a while, but eventually the pretense will destroy you." Sarah felt something twist in her chest, a recognition that was both painful and liberating. "So you decided to stop pretending?" "We decided to find a way to be who we really are while still contributing something positive to the world. That's how Sentinel Solutions was born. We use our skills to protect people who can't protect themselves, to go into dangerous situations that regular security firms won't touch. And you think I should join you?" Marcus turned to face her directly, his expression serious but not pressuring. I think you should consider it. But, more than that, I think you should tell me what happened over there that made you decide to disappear. Sarah was quiet for so long that she began to think Marcus would give up and leave. But he waited patiently, understanding that some stories needed time to surface. Finally, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a mission, she said. November 2021, outside of Kabul. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a bomb maker who was responsible for IEDs that had killed dozens of coalition forces. My unit was tasked with surveillance and elimination if the opportunity arose. Marcus nodded encouragingly, but didn't interrupt. I had the shot, Sarah continued. Perfect conditions, clear line of sight, target confirmed. But, just as I was about to squeeze the trigger, a child ran into my field of view. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, playing in the courtyard where our target was meeting with his associates. Sarah's hands began to tremble as the memories flooded back. I held my fire, of course. But, while I waited for the child to move, more civilians appeared. Women hanging laundry, elderly men sitting in the shade, children playing games. The target was surrounded by innocent people, and there was no clean shot. What did you do? I reported the situation to command. Told them I couldn't take the shot without risking civilian casualties. But my commanding officer, he had different ideas about acceptable risk. Sarah's voice grew bitter. He ordered me to take the shot anyway. Said that eliminating one bomb maker was worth the risk to a few civilians. Marcus's expression darkened. You refused. I refused. And, because I refused, the target slipped away. 3 days later, one of his IEDs killed 4 American soldiers and wounded 12 more. Sarah's voice broke slightly. Good people died because I couldn't pull the trigger when ordered to. Sarah, Marcus said firmly, you made the right choice. Following illegal orders to kill civilians would have been a war crime. Tell that to the families of the soldiers who died because I hesitated. You didn't hesitate. You made a moral choice under impossible circumstances. That takes more courage than following orders ever could. Sarah wiped her eyes, surprised to find them wet. The army agreed with you, actually. There was an investigation, and my commanding officer was relieved of duty for giving illegal orders. But, by then, the damage was done. I couldn't carry my rifle anymore without seeing that little girl's face. Every time I looked through my scope, I wondered if this was the shot that would make me a killer of innocence. So you requested discharge. So I ran away, Sarah corrected. I couldn't handle being a sniper anymore, but I also couldn't handle being anything else. The army was my whole identity, and when I lost that, I lost myself. So I came here, to the middle of nowhere, and tried to become someone completely different. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing her story. And how's that working out for you? Sarah almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Terrible. Every day feels like I'm wearing a costume that doesn't fit. I'm pretending to care about coffee temperatures and tip calculations when all I can think about is whether I made the right choice that day. Whether those soldiers would still be alive if I had just followed orders. The answer to that question isn't yes or no, Marcus said. The answer is that you'll never know, and torture yourself with hypotheticals will only destroy what's left of your life. So what do? Marcus stood up and gestured for his team to join them. You stop pretending to be someone you're not, and you start figuring out how to be who you really are in a way that honors both your skills and your conscience. As the 5 men gathered around the bench, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the sense of belonging that came from being with people who understood her background and respected her choices. They looked at her not as a damaged veteran hiding from her past, but as a skilled professional who had made a difficult moral decision under extreme pressure. We have a job starting next month, Marcus continued. A humanitarian organization is sending medical teams into Syria to treat refugees in contested areas. They need security specialists who can protect the medical personnel while they do their work. Clean mission, clear moral purpose, no gray areas. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to be who you really are while doing something that matters. Your skills as a sniper would be invaluable for Overwatch and protection duties. And, just as importantly, you'd be using those skills to save lives instead of taking them. Sarah looked at the 5 men surrounding her, seeing in their faces the same mixture of damage and purpose that she carried within herself. They had all walked away from military service and found a way to continue serving without compromising their principles. It wasn't the same as her situation, but it was similar enough to offer hope. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Marcus replied, handing her another business card. "This one has my personal cell number. Call me when you've made your decision, or if you just need to talk to someone who understands what you've been through." As the team prepared to leave, Danny Walsh approached her one more time. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I spent 3 years having nightmares about shots I didn't take and people I couldn't save. It wasn't until I found these guys that I realized the nightmares weren't punishment for my failures. They were proof that I still had a conscience worth listening to." After they left, Sarah sat alone on the bench as full darkness settled over Millbrook. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where her skills and experience could be assets rather than burdens. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and considering whether to jump. But as she walked home through the quiet streets of her adopted town, Sarah realized that she had already been falling for 3 years. The only question now was whether she wanted to continue falling alone or find a way to land on her feet with people who could help her build something meaningful from the pieces of who she used to be. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Millbrook settling into its peaceful nighttime routine. The distant hum of traffic on Route 15, the soft chiming of the church bell marking the hours, the rustle of wind through the maple trees that lined her street. These sounds had become the soundtrack of her exile, comforting in their predictability and emptiness. But now they felt different. Instead of sanctuary, they sounded like stagnation. Instead of peace, they echoed with the hollow ring of a life half-lived. She got up before dawn and drove to the overlook outside town, a scenic pullout where tourists sometimes stopped to photograph the valley spread out below. In the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah sat on the hood of her car and tried to make sense of the emotions that Marcus Reed and his team had stirred up. For 3 years, she had successfully numbed herself to almost everything. She went through the motions of living without really feeling alive, and that had seemed like enough. Now, suddenly, it wasn't enough anymore. The business card with Marcus's personal number lay on the dashboard beside her, catching the first rays of sunlight as dawn broke over the Pennsylvania hills. Sarah picked it up and turned it over in her hands, studying the plain white card as if it might reveal some hidden truth about her future. By the time she arrived at Miller's Diner for her morning shift, Sarah had made her decision. But she wasn't ready to announce it yet. Instead, she went through her usual routine with mechanical precision, pouring coffee and taking orders while her mind worked through the practical implications of what she was contemplating. Jenny noticed her distraction immediately. "Honey, you look like you've been wrestling with demons all night," she said during a brief lull between the breakfast and lunch rushes. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, then paused and reconsidered. "Actually, I'm thinking about making some changes in my life." "What kind of changes?" Sarah looked around the diner, taking in the familiar faces and comfortable routines that had defined her existence for 3 years. "Big changes. The kind that can't be undone once you make them." Jenny's expression grew concerned. "You're not thinking of doing anything foolish, are you?" "That depends on your definition of foolish," Sarah said with a small smile. "Some people might say that walking away from a safe, predictable life is foolish. Other people might say that staying in a life that makes you miserable is even more foolish." Before Jenny could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a familiar figure entering the diner. It was Danny Walsh, the young veteran with green eyes who had first spotted her tattoo. He was alone this time, dressed in civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise his military bearing. He approached the counter where Sarah was standing and nodded politely to Jenny before addressing Sarah directly. "Ma'am, I was hoping I could have a word with you when you have a minute." Jenny looked between them with obvious curiosity, but Sarah quickly intervened. "Let me take my break," she told Jenny, then turned to Danny. "We can talk outside." They walked around to the employee parking area behind the diner, where Danny's motorcycle was parked next to Sarah's aging Honda. In the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah could see details about him that she had missed the day before. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his late 20s, but His eyes held the weight of experiences that belonged to someone much older. Marcus sent you, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Marcus doesn't know I'm here, Danny replied. This is my own idea, and he'd probably be pissed if he knew about it. Then, why are you here? Danny leaned against his motorcycle and studied her carefully. Because yesterday, when you were talking about that mission in Afghanistan, I saw something in your face that I recognized. The look of someone who's been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to them. Sarah crossed her arms defensively. I don't need therapy from someone I just met. You're right, you don't. But maybe you need to hear from someone who's been exactly where you are. Danny's voice was matter-of-fact, without any trace of condescension. I told you yesterday that I was a spotter for Marine snipers in Helmand. What I didn't tell you was that I failed in that role in a way that got good people killed. Despite herself, Sarah found herself listening intently. There was something in Danny's tone that suggested he wasn't sharing this story lightly. We were supporting a patrol that had been pinned down by enemy fire, Danny continued. My sniper and I were in an overwatch position about 800 meters away, and we could see the entire engagement. The enemy fighters were using a school building as their firing position, and intelligence suggested it was empty. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. But it wasn't empty. No, it wasn't. About 30 kids had been hiding in the basement when the fighting started, too scared to leave. We didn't know they were there until after my sniper took his shots, and the building started taking return fire from our ground forces. How many children were hurt? Danny's jaw tightened. 12 injured, 3 killed. All because I missed a thermal signature on my scope that would have shown there were civilians in the building. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of Danny's admission. What happened to you afterward? Court of inquiry found that I had followed proper procedures, and that the intelligence failure wasn't my fault. Didn't matter. I couldn't look through a scope again without seeing those kids' faces. I finished my tour and got out as soon as my enlistment was up. And then, I spent 2 years drinking myself to death in dive bars from San Diego to Portland, convinced that I was a monster who deserved to suffer for what I'd done. Danny's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the echoes of pain beneath the words. I probably would have succeeded in killing myself with alcohol if Jake hadn't found me and dragged me into Sentinel Solutions. What changed? Danny gestured toward the diner, where the lunch crowd was visible through the windows, going about their ordinary lives in blissful ignorance of the conversation happening outside. Jake made me understand that guilt without purpose is just self-indulgence. Those kids died because of my mistake, and no amount of suffering on my part was going to bring them back. But I could honor their memory by using my skills to protect other children, other innocents. Is that what you've been doing? For the last 18 months, yeah. We've protected refugee camps in South Sudan, escorted medical supplies through cartel territory in Colombia, provided security for teachers working in areas controlled by Boko Haram. Danny met her eyes directly. Every mission where we prevent harm from coming to civilians is a small way of balancing the scales for what happened in Helmand. Sarah felt something shifting in her chest, like a weight that had been pressing down on her for 3 years was finally starting to lift. You think I should take Marcus's offer? I think you should stop punishing yourself for making the right choice in an impossible situation, Danny replied. You refused an illegal order to kill civilians. That makes you a hero, not a failure. But people died because I refused. People die in war, Danny said bluntly. That's what war is. But you didn't kill those soldiers, and you didn't plant that IED. The only person responsible for their deaths is the bomb maker who built the weapon and the terrorists who planted it. Sarah looked back toward the diner, where she could see Jenny watching them through the kitchen window with poorly concealed concern. In a few minutes, she would have to go back inside and resume her performance as Sarah Martinez, the quiet waitress who wanted nothing more than to blend into the background of small-town life. What's the Syria mission like? She asked. Danny's expression brightened slightly. Medical team from Doctors Without Borders is setting up a field hospital about 20 kilometers from Aleppo. They'll be treating refugees, including a lot of kids who've been displaced by the fighting. Our job would be to provide perimeter security and overwatch while they work. How long? 3 months, maybe 4 if they decide to extend the mission. Long enough to make a real difference in a lot of lives. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing the familiar safety of her current life against the unknown challenges of returning to the world she had tried so hard to leave behind. It would mean giving up the anonymity she had worked so hard to build, the comfortable predictability of her daily routine, the illusion that she could escape her past by simply ignoring it. But it would also mean using her skills for something that mattered, working alongside people who understood her background and respected her choices, and possibly finding a way to transform her guilt into something constructive. If I were to consider this, Sarah said carefully, what would be expected of me? Overwatch and counter-sniper duties primarily, Danny replied. The area where we'll be working is contested, which means there's always a risk of sniper fire from enemy positions. Your job would be to provide security for the medical teams and neutralize any threats that emerge. Neutralize meaning kill. If necessary, yes. But the goal would always be to deter and disable rather than eliminate. Most of the time, the knowledge that there's a skilled counter-sniper in the area is enough to keep enemy snipers from operating in the vicinity. Sarah nodded slowly. The idea of returning to active duty, even in a civilian capacity, was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that she never wanted to hold a rifle again. But the truth was that she missed the clarity and purpose that came with using her skills in service of something larger than herself. I need to call Marcus, she said finally. Danny smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him. He's going to be pleased. We all are, actually. The team has been incomplete since our last sniper transferred to another company 6 months ago. Don't celebrate yet, Sarah warned. I haven't said yes. You don't have to say it, Danny replied as he climbed onto his motorcycle. It's written all over your face. You've already decided. As Danny rode away, Sarah realized he was right. Somewhere during their conversation, she had crossed a line in her thinking that she couldn't uncross. The question was no longer whether she should leave Millbrook and join Sentinel Solutions. The question was how quickly she could make the transition without burning bridges or leaving people in the lurch. She spent the rest of her shift thinking through the practical details. She would need to give old Pete and the diner owners at least 2 weeks' notice, long enough for them to hire and train a replacement. Her apartment lease was month to month, so that wouldn't be a problem. She had very few possessions that couldn't be packed into her car or sold to neighbors. The hardest part would be explaining her departure to people like Jenny, who had become genuinely fond of her over the past 3 years. But even that felt manageable now that she had a clear purpose driving her decision. When her shift ended, Sarah drove to the overlook where she had watched the sunrise that morning. This time, she parked facing west, watching the sun set over the valley that had been her refuge for 3 years. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus Reed's number. He answered on the second ring. Sarah? Danny Walsh came to see me today, she said without preamble. That kid needs to learn to follow orders, Marcus replied. But Sarah could hear amusement in his voice rather than anger. He told me about Helmand Province. About the children who were killed. Danny's been carrying that weight for a long time. We all have our versions of that story. What's yours? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped by asking such a personal question. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. Fallujah, 2004. I was a lieutenant leading a platoon through house-to-house clearing operations. Intelligence said a particular building was being used as an insurgent weapons cache, so we went in hard and fast. Turned out to be a family home where 3 generations of civilians were hiding from the fighting. Were they hurt? An elderly grandfather had a heart attack during the raid and died before we could get medical attention to him. His grandson, maybe 8 years old, looked at me like I was the devil himself when we carried his grandfather's body out of that house. Sarah felt the familiar ache of shared trauma, the recognition that came from talking to someone who understood the weight of unintended consequences in war zones. How do you live with it? By accepting that the past can't be changed, but the future can still be influenced, Marcus replied. That grandfather died because I followed bad intelligence into a situation I didn't fully understand. I can't bring him back, but I can make damn sure that my current missions are planned well enough to minimize civilian casualties. Is that enough? It has to be, Marcus said simply. The alternative is to let the guilt consume you until you're no good to anyone, including yourself. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the clean evening air and listening to the sounds of the valley settling into twilight. I want to take the job in Syria. Are you sure? There's no shame in saying no, Sarah. You've built a life here, and walking away from that is a big decision. I've built a hiding place here, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. I'm ready to start living again instead of just surviving. Okay then, Marcus said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Welcome to Sentinel Solutions. Can you be in Philadelphia next Monday for briefings and equipment preparation? I'll be there. Sarah, Marcus added before she could hang up. I know this feels like a big leap, but you're not jumping alone. We're a team, and we take care of our own. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car and watched the last light fade from the western sky. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of dismantling the life she had built in Millbrook and preparing for a future that was both uncertain and full of possibility. She would have difficult conversations with Jenny and old Pete, pack her belongings, and say goodbye to the town that had sheltered her during the worst period of her life. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Chun allowed herself to feel genuinely hopeful about what came next. The guilt and shame that had driven her into hiding were still there, but they no longer felt like an insurmountable weight. Instead, they had become fuel for a different kind of purpose, one that honored both her skills and her conscience. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Sarah realized that Danny Walsh had been right about something else. The decision to join Sentinel Solutions hadn't been made during their conversation that afternoon. It had been building for 3 years, accumulating momentum every time she felt the hollow ache of a life unfulfilled, every time she caught herself missing the clarity and purpose that had defined her military service. Meeting Marcus Reed and his team had simply given her permission to stop running from who she really was and start figuring out how to be that person in a way that made the world a better place. It wasn't redemption, exactly, but it was something perhaps more valuable, the chance to transform her past trauma into future purpose, and to discover that healing didn't require forgetting but rather finding new meaning in old wounds. 6 months later, Sarah crouched behind a concrete barrier on the roof of a bombed-out apartment building 20 kilometers east of Aleppo, her eye pressed to the scope of a precision rifle she hadn't touched in over 3 years. The familiar weight of the weapon felt strange at first, like greeting an old friend after a long and painful separation, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. Within hours of picking up the rifle again during training in Philadelphia, her body had remembered what her mind had tried so hard to forget. Below her position, the field hospital operated with the controlled urgency that she had come to associate with Doctors Without Borders missions. Canvas tents stretched across what had once been a school playground, creating a maze of treatment areas, surgical suites, and recovery wards. Medical personnel in their distinctive white coats moved between patients with practiced efficiency, treating everything from combat wounds to childhood illnesses to the chronic malnutrition that plagued the refugee population. Sarah's job was to watch over them all, to scan the surrounding buildings and rooftops for any sign of threat, and to neutralize hostile snipers before they could disrupt the medical operations below. It was work that required intense concentration and absolute patience, skills that came back to her more easily than she had expected. In the 3 days since the field hospital had become operational, Sarah had identified and deterred 4 potential sniper positions, forcing hostile shooters to relocate rather than risk a confrontation with a counter-sniper whose skills were clearly superior to their own. She hadn't been forced to fire a shot yet, which was exactly how she preferred things to go. Overwatch, this is command. Marcus's voice crackled through her earpiece. We've got movement in Building 7, 3rd floor, northeast corner window. Sarah adjusted her scope to focus on the structure Marcus had identified, a partially collapsed office building about 600 meters to the northeast. Through the scope, she could see a figure moving carefully behind the broken windows, attempting to establish a shooting position that would give them a clear line of fire to the medical compound. Visual confirmed, Sarah replied, her voice calm and professional. One individual appears to be carrying a rifle. Looks like he's trying to set up for a shot at the main surgical tent. Can you deter without engaging? Sarah studied the situation carefully. The hostile sniper was still in the process of setting up his position, which gave her several options for dealing with the threat. She could wait and see if he would abandon his position once he realized he was being watched, or she could take more active measures to convince him to leave. Sending a message, Sarah said. adjusting her aim to a point about 2 feet to the left of where the hostile sniper was crouched. She squeezed the trigger, sending a round that shattered the concrete near the enemy position in a spray of dust and debris. The effect was immediate. The figure in the window jerked back from his position and scrambled away from the window, clearly understanding that he was outmatched and under surveillance by a superior marksman. Within seconds, he had disappeared entirely from Sarah's field of view. Target has withdrawn, Sarah reported. Building 7 is clear. Outstanding work, Overwatch, Marcus replied. That's the third deterrent action today. Word is getting around that we have serious counter-sniper capabilities. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she continued scanning the surrounding area. The psychological effect of effective counter-sniper operations was often more valuable than the tactical results. When hostile forces knew that they were being watched by a skilled marksman, they became cautious, hesitant, less likely to engage in the kind of aggressive tactics that could disrupt humanitarian operations. Sarah, this is Dr. Martinez. A new voice came through her earpiece. The coincidence of the shared last name had been a source of mild amusement when Sarah had been introduced to the medical team leader, a Spanish physician who had been working in conflict zones for over 15 years. Go ahead, doctor. We've got a situation developing in the pediatric treatment area. Local forces are trying to evacuate their wounded ahead of some kind of offensive operation, and they want to commandeer our medical supplies. Danny and Carlos are handling the diplomatic side, but I need to know if you see any military buildup that might indicate we need to consider evacuating. Sarah swept her scope across the horizon, looking for signs of troop movement or equipment staging that might suggest an imminent military operation. What she saw made her stomach tighten with concern. Command, I've got eyes on a convoy of vehicles about 2 kilometers to the west, moving in our direction. Looks like at least a dozen trucks, probably carrying infantry. And I'm seeing artillery pieces being moved into position on the ridgeline to the south. Copy that, Marcus replied, his voice tense. How long before they reach our position? Sarah did quick calculations based on the convoy's speed and the terrain they would have to navigate. Convoy will be here in maybe 20 minutes. Artillery is already in range if they choose to engage. Dr. Martinez, you need to start evacuation procedures now, Marcus said. We can't protect the hospital if we're in the middle of an active combat zone. Sarah watched through her scope as organized chaos erupted in the compound below. Medical staff began the complex process of stabilizing patients for transport, packing critical supplies, and coordinating with the Sentinel Solutions team to ensure security during the evacuation. It was a procedure they had drilled extensively, but this was the first time they had been forced to implement it under actual threat conditions. Overwatch, we're going to need you to provide cover while we move the patients. Danny's voice came through the radio. Can you maintain your position until we get everyone loaded? Sarah checked her ammunition count and assessed her tactical situation. Her rooftop position gave her excellent fields of fire in all directions, but it would also make her a priority target once hostile forces realized she was there. If she stayed too long, she risked being cut off from her extraction route. I can give you 15 minutes of cover, she replied. After that, I'll have to displace to avoid being surrounded. Understood. We'll make it work. As the evacuation began below, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she had with Danny Walsh in the parking lot behind Miller's Diner 6 months earlier. He had talked about balancing the scales for past mistakes by protecting innocence in new situations, and now she was living that philosophy in real time. Through her scope, she watched medical personnel carefully moving patients from treatment tents to armored ambulances, their movements urgent but controlled. Many of the patients were children, victims of the ongoing conflict who had been receiving treatment for everything from combat injuries to preventable diseases. The idea that these vulnerable people might be caught in the crossfire of a military operation made Sarah's resolve harden into something approaching fury. Movement in Building 4, she reported, spotting armed figures attempting to establish positions that would allow them to fire on the evacuation convoy. Multiple hostiles. Appears to be an advance team trying to set up an ambush. Take them out, Marcus ordered without hesitation. Sarah's training took over, her breathing slowing to a steady rhythm as she acquired her targets. Unlike the earlier deterrent shots, These would be precision eliminations designed to neutralize immediate threats to the medical personnel below. She had spent 3 years trying to avoid this moment, but now that it had arrived, she found herself feeling only a calm sense of purpose. Her first shot took out the team leader, dropping him cleanly before he could signal his companions. The second shot scattered the rest of the team, forcing them to abandon their position and retreat to cover deeper in the building. It was surgical, efficient, exactly the kind of precision work that had made her reputation in the 75th Rangers. Threats neutralized, she reported. Convoy is clear to proceed. The evacuation continued with military precision, each vehicle loaded with patients and essential supplies before moving out under the protective cover of Sentinel Solutions security teams. Sarah maintained overwatch throughout the process, her scope constantly moving to scan for new threats while her mind kept track of timing and ammunition. Last vehicle is loaded, Danny reported. Overwatch, time to go. Sarah packed her equipment with practiced speed, breaking down her rifle and securing her gear for rapid movement. The hostile convoy was now less than 10 minutes away, close enough that she could hear the rumble of diesel engines across the valley. If she was going to reach the extraction point, she had to move now. The route down from her rooftop position took her through the abandoned apartment building and out through a rear courtyard that connected to a network of alleyways leading to the extraction point. It was a path she had scouted during the initial setup, but running it under time pressure while carrying a full combat load was a different experience entirely. As she reached the extraction point, a reinforced position behind the ruins of a gas station, Sarah could see the last of the medical convoy disappearing over the horizon to the east. The evacuation had been successful, with all patients and personnel safely removed from the area before hostile forces could interfere with the operation. Overwatch is at the extraction point, she reported as Jake's armored vehicle pulled up behind the gas station. Outstanding work, Marcus replied as Sarah climbed into the passenger seat. Clean, professional, exactly what we needed. As they drove away from the abandoned field hospital site, Sarah looked back at the compound they had been protecting for the past week. The empty tents flapped in the wind like ghost flags, evidence of the humanitarian work that had been accomplished before circumstances forced their withdrawal. In 7 days of operation, the medical team had treated over 300 patients, performed dozens of surgical procedures, and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to the ongoing conflict. How do you feel? Jake asked as they navigated through the rubble-strewn streets toward their base camp. Sarah considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, the idea of firing her rifle in combat would have filled her with dread and self-doubt. But today, when she had been forced to engage hostile targets threatening innocent civilians, she had felt only clarity and purpose. I feel like I'm doing the work I was meant to do, she said finally. That evening, as the Sentinel Solutions team debriefed the evacuation operation at their temporary base, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from the hiding place of Millbrook to the rooftops of Syria. The guilt and shame that had driven her into exile were still there, but they had been transformed into something constructive, a driving force that motivated her to use her skills in service of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The medical team wants to set up a new position about 50 kilometers to the north, Marcus announced during the briefing. They've identified a refugee camp that hasn't had medical attention in over 6 months. If we can provide security, they can establish a treatment facility that could serve several thousand displaced civilians. Sarah nodded along with the rest of the team. It would be another dangerous assignment in a contested area, requiring the same kind of precision overwatch that she had provided at the previous location. But it would also be another opportunity to make a tangible difference in the lives of people who desperately needed help. After the briefing, Danny found her sitting outside the command tent, cleaning her rifle under the star-filled Syrian sky. You did good work today, he said, settling down beside her on an ammunition crate. We all did good work today, Sarah replied, running the cleaning rod through the barrel with mechanical precision. That's what teams are for. I'm not talking about team performance. I'm talking about you personally. 6 months ago, you couldn't imagine holding a rifle again without thinking about that mission in Afghanistan. Today, you used your skills to save lives and protect innocence. That's not just professional growth, that's personal healing. Sarah paused in her cleaning routine and looked up at the stars. I still think about that little girl in Kabul sometimes. I still wonder what would have happened if I had taken the shot when ordered. The difference is that now you don't let those thoughts paralyze you, Danny observed. You use them to motivate you to do better work in current situations. Is that what healing looks like? It's what healing looks like for people like us, Danny replied. We don't get to forget what we've seen or what we've done. But we can transform our experiences into wisdom, our guilt into purpose, our trauma into strength. As Danny walked back toward the command tent, Sarah finished cleaning her rifle and assembled it with practiced efficiency. Tomorrow they would begin preparations for the next mission, another opportunity to use her skills in service of humanitarian goals. It wasn't the life she had planned when she first enlisted in the army, and it certainly wasn't the life she had imagined during her 3 years of hiding in Millbrook. But it was a life that honored both her capabilities and her conscience, a way of being in the world that transformed her military training into something constructive rather than destructive. The scared, guilt-ridden woman who had hidden behind long sleeves and false names in a small-town diner was still part of her, but she was no longer the whole story. Sarah Chun had found her way back to herself, not by forgetting her past, but by finding new meaning in it. The tattoo on her wrist that read Sniper Division was no longer a source of shame, but a reminder of skills that could be used to protect rather than destroy, to save lives rather than take them. 3 weeks later, as she maintained overwatch for another field hospital treating refugee children, Sarah received an unexpected message on her satellite phone. It was a text from Ginny at Miller's Diner. Saw a news story about American security team protecting doctors in Syria. Made me think of you. Hope you found what you were looking for. Stay safe. Jay, Sarah smiled as she typed back. Found more than I was looking for. Found purpose. Take care of yourself. S. As she put the phone away and returned her attention to her scope, Sarah realized that Jenny's message had crystallized something important. She hadn't just found a new job or a new team. She had found a way to transform her past trauma into present purpose, her guilt into motivation, her isolation into belonging. The waitress who had asked about her tattoo in a small-town diner would never have believed this ending to the story. But then, again, sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we never see coming. And sometimes the most profound healing happens when we stop trying to forget who we used to be and start figuring out who we're meant to become. 6 months after leaving Millbrook, Sarah Chun was exactly where she belonged, watching over innocents with a precision rifle and a clear conscience, part of a team that understood her past and supported her future, using her skills to write a better ending to a story that had once seemed irredeemably broken.